My parents went into my garage while I was working a double shift, used the spare key they had been holding since my surgery the year before, and handed it directly to my younger sister. 14 hours later, my $67,000 Chevy Silverado High Country was wrapped around a concrete barrier on the interstate. Her fiance had vanished from the scene before the first officer arrived, and my parents were calling my phone at 5 in the morning to tell me this was somehow my fault. Stay with me until the end of this, because what my family did to protect my sister came within inches of destroying everything I had spent 5 years building, and what I uncovered about that night changed the way I see every person I grew up calling family. My name is Yvonne Reed. I am 34 years old and I work as a licensed occupational therapist. I specialize in helping patients who have survived strokes or spinal injuries relearn how to move through their daily lives. The work is demanding in ways that are hard to explain to people who haven't seen it. You hold people at their lowest. You push them past the point where they want to quit, and you learn very quickly that nothing meaningful comes without effort. That lesson shaped how I approached my entire life, not just my career. I didn't grow up with money. My parents worked hard but stretched every dollar thin. I watched them juggle bills when I was a teenager, and I told myself early on that I was going to build something stable on my own terms. So that's exactly what I did. I picked up per diem shifts on weekends. I worked every holiday nobody else wanted. I lived in an apartment smaller than what I could have afforded, because I was saving. And after 5 years of doing exactly that, I purchased my dream vehicle, a fully loaded Chevy Silverado High Country in midnight blue. Every cent came from overtime shifts and sacrifices that most people around me would never fully appreciate. Unfortunately, my family never treated that kind of effort as something worth acknowledging. Not when it came to me. My younger sister had been the favorite for as long as I could remember. When she needed help with rent, my parents found the money. When she made mistakes, they made excuses. When she hurt people, they found ways to reframe the story until she came out looking like the one who had been wronged. I had watched the pattern repeat itself my entire life. I wasn't bitter about it, or at least I told myself I wasn't. I just kept my distance and kept building. By last fall, my sister was engaged to a man who had a personality that filled every room he entered and a track record that told a very different story. My parents seemed genuinely charmed by him, but he bounced between jobs, borrowed money without returning it, and had a habit of making promises he never delivered on. My sister was so wrapped up in planning the wedding that she seemed unable to see any of it clearly. The trouble started on a Sunday evening in October. My parents had everyone over for dinner, which they did every few weeks. I almost didn't go, but I decided to show up because I hadn't seen them in a while and I wanted things to stay civil between us. Everything was fine until after the meal, when my sister started talking about a venue she wanted to visit for her engagement party. The location was about 40 minutes outside of the city. She said her car had been making a sound she didn't trust on the highway. Then she looked across the table at me and asked if she could borrow my truck. I said no immediately. The truck was brand new. It was my biggest purchase, and I wasn't comfortable letting anyone drive it. I said it as calmly as I could manage. I told her I hoped she could work something else out, but the truck wasn't available. My sister rolled her eyes and called me selfish. My parents stepped in almost instantly. My mother started explaining that the venue appointment was the next morning and that rescheduling would be difficult. My father leaned back in his chair and said, very calmly, that family helps family. I reminded both of them that my sister had her own car. My mother said the noise coming from the engine was worrying. My father said I was being rigid about something small. When I still wouldn't budge, the mood in the room changed in a way I felt before I could name it. My father stood up and walked to the counter where I had set my bag down when I arrived. Before I fully registered what was happening, he reached into the side pocket and pulled out my truck keys. He held them out to my sister without a word. My sister looked at the keys, looked at me, and took them from his hand. I was stunned. The truck was mine. I had paid for every dollar of it. Yet the two people who raised me had just handed my property to someone else after I had clearly and calmly said no. I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked out of the house without another word. I was too angry and too humiliated to sit there for one more second. I tried to calm down on the drive home. I called a friend and vented. She told me to sleep on it and handle it in the morning, so I tried. What I didn't know yet was that while I was lying in bed trying to decompress, a chain of events had already started that would not stop until it had pulled my family completely apart. I was still half asleep, just before 5 in the morning when my phone began vibrating against the nightstand. I assumed I had overslept and missed an alarm. But when I looked at the screen, I saw my mother's name. She had called 6 times in the last 20 minutes. I picked up. Her voice was pitched several degrees higher than normal. She kept saying my name before I could get a word in. Then my father took the phone. "Yvonne," he said. His voice sounded wrong in a way I couldn't identify yet. "Your truck has been in an accident." I sat up in bed. My brain tried to process the sentence. "What do you mean?" "It's bad," he said. "It's on the highway. The police are already there." I remember my hands going cold. I asked what had happened, who was involved, whether anyone was hurt. My father's answers were short and strange. He kept saying he didn't have all the details. He kept telling me to stay calm. What he did not say, not once in that entire conversation, was who had been behind the wheel. When I finally reached my sister later that morning, her story was already strange. She told me she had only borrowed the truck briefly the night before to handle something quick, that she had returned the keys to my parents hours before the accident, and that she had no idea what had happened after that. She said it quickly and flatly, like someone reading from a prepared statement. I asked who had been driving when the crash happened. She said she didn't know. I asked where her fiance was. There was a pause. Then she said she hadn't spoken to him since the night before. Something about the way she said it made me stop. I had known my sister my entire life. I knew what it sounded like when she was telling the truth. This was not that. The next several days were a collision of phone calls, insurance notices, and conversations that never quite added up. Police confirmed the truck had been totaled after striking a concrete divider on the interstate. An officer mentioned there had been some confusion at the scene about who had been driving, that witnesses had given inconsistent information, and that the registered owner, me, had not been present. My sister's fiance had also not been present by the time officers arrived. No one could explain where he had gone. Then there was the text message. I noticed it that first morning, buried between the missed calls from my parents. It had come in at 11:46 the night before, from my sister's fiance's number. It said, "Call me when you get a minute. There are things you should know before this gets complicated." I stared at that message for a long time. I didn't understand what he meant yet. Within a week I would understand exactly what he meant. My parents spent the days after the crash doing something I should have seen coming. They started building a story. Not the kind you bring to a courtroom, the kind you build in phone calls to relatives, and text threads to people who weren't there. My father called me one evening, and walked me through what he thought I should tell the insurance company. His suggestion was that I had willingly loaned the truck to my sister for the weekend. He framed it as the path of least resistance. He said it would make everything simpler. I told him that was not what happened, and that I was not going to say it was. He got quiet. Then he said I was making something difficult, even harder than it needed to be. My mother called the next morning and delivered almost the same script. She added that my sister was already overwhelmed with wedding stress, and that this situation was putting enormous pressure on her. When I pointed out that I was the one whose truck had been destroyed, my mother said I had always been the stronger one. She meant it as a compliment. It did not land that way. Within 2 weeks, the atmosphere inside my extended family had shifted noticeably. Relatives who had always been warm toward me went quiet. A few sent messages that were politely distant in the way messages are when someone has already been discussed before they arrive. My parents had been narrating the situation to anyone who would listen, and their version had me at the center of every problem. I had never felt that kind of isolation from the people I grew up with. It was different from ordinary conflict. It felt like being slowly erased. I was sitting at my kitchen table one night in November, going through a folder I had been building, receipts, text messages, the insurance report, anything I could pull together, when something inside me shifted. I had been spending all my energy responding to accusations. I needed to start finding answers. So I started from the beginning and worked forward. My sister claimed she had returned the truck to my parents hours before the accident. The crash happened around 1 in the morning. If her timeline was accurate, she would have delivered the truck before midnight, and someone else would have taken it after that. I started pulling on threads. The highway where the crash happened ran through a stretch of retail and restaurants I knew well. I spent 2 afternoons visiting businesses along the route, asking questions, showing people the date and time I was interested in. Most people didn't have useful information, but a cashier at a gas station a few miles from the crash site mentioned that investigators had already come in to request their security footage from that night. That told me something. If there was footage worth requesting, something was on it. Through patience, attorney consultations, and following up carefully with people connected to the investigation, I eventually learned what that footage showed. It showed my sister standing beside my truck at 12:41 in the morning, less than 20 minutes before the crash. She had not returned the truck before midnight. She had not been separated from the vehicle hours earlier. She had been at that gas station with my truck 12 minutes before it ended up wrapped around a highway divider. When I confronted her with this, her story fractured in real time. First she said she had only stopped briefly. Then she said she was meeting a friend. Then she said she couldn't remember that part of the night clearly because she had been tired and upset after dinner. Each version contradicted the last one. My parents refused to engage with any of it. Instead of asking my sister why her timeline kept changing, they called me obsessive. My mother said I was damaging the family over a vehicle. My father said I was punishing my sister because I had never wanted to help her in the first place. Not once did either of them ask why a woman who claimed to have returned keys before 10 o'clock was photographed beside that truck at 12:41 with the engine running. Then came the discovery that changed everything. My truck was under a year old. It had a factory-installed GPS and data logging system that records location and movement history. I requested access to those records expecting to trace every mile the truck had traveled that night. What I found instead were gaps. Not a missing hour from a technical glitch. Entire sections of the movement history had been removed. The gaps were not random, and they were not consistent with any kind of system malfunction. Someone who understood how the system worked had accessed it and deleted portions of the record deliberately. I sat with that for a long time. Tracking data does not erase itself. Whoever had gone into those records had done it on purpose. And they had done it because they knew what the missing data would have shown. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling like a family conflict and started feeling like something else entirely. My sister's fiance had been unreachable since the night of the crash. His phone went to voicemail every time. His apartment was empty when a mutual acquaintance checked on it. No one had heard a word from him. People assumed he had caused the accident and fled the consequences. But the text he sent me before midnight, "There are things you should know before this gets complicated," had not come from someone with nothing to hide. It had come from someone who wanted to say something and couldn't figure out how. In early December, I got a call from the private investigator I had hired 2 weeks earlier. She told me she had found him. He was staying with a cousin 4 hours away. He had been there since the night of the crash. I spoke with him a few days later. He looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. He avoided eye contact for the first several minutes. When he finally started talking, the words came out carefully, like he had rehearsed them, but also like he had been waiting to say them to someone for a long time. He told me my sister had been driving the truck that night. They had argued repeatedly throughout the evening, and as the argument escalated, her driving became increasingly erratic. He had asked her more than once to pull over. She refused. The crash happened when she overcorrected going into a curve, lost control, and hit the divider. When the truck came to a stop, they were shaken but able to move. She told him to get out and walk. She told him she needed time to figure out what to tell her parents before anyone else arrived. He walked nearly 2 miles in the dark before someone stopped to pick him up. He told me my sister had called my parents from the side of the road before she called anyone else. He didn't know exactly what was said in that conversation, but by the time he spoke to her again the next day, the story had already been shaped. He was supposed to stay out of sight while the family worked out how to explain the accident. He had agreed because he was afraid of legal consequences, afraid of being blamed for something he hadn't fully controlled, afraid of what a family looks like when it is closing ranks around someone. Then he told me something that landed differently than anything else. He said he had overheard my parents, in the days after the crash, discussing what would happen if the insurance company started asking uncomfortable questions. He said the name that kept coming up in those conversations was mine. I drove home that night and sat in my apartment without turning on any lights. I had started all of this trying to prove I hadn't done anything wrong. What I had uncovered was something much larger than that. My parents hadn't simply accepted my sister's story. they had helped construct it. And the person they had quietly positioned to absorb the consequences was me. I hired an attorney the following week. She was thorough and direct. She helped me organize everything I had gathered into a coherent timeline. The gas station footage with the timestamp, the phone record showing my sister and her fiance together throughout the night. Restaurant receipts, placing them at a location 40 minutes from my parents' house at 10:30. More than 2 hours after my sister claimed she had returned the truck, and the gap in the GPS data that any reasonable person would recognize as deliberate interference. Most importantly, my sister's fiancé was willing to make a formal statement. Once he committed to that, everything else began to move. My sister's version of events had functioned for months, because no one with any authority had ever forced her to defend it under real scrutiny. Now that scrutiny was coming, and the cracks widened with every new piece of information that entered the record. She stopped giving firm answers and started claiming she couldn't remember. She stopped correcting my parents when they spoke on her behalf, and started deferring to them entirely. My parents, who had spent months acting as though they controlled how this story would be told, began to look visibly uneasy. My father stopped making confident statements to relatives. My mother became careful in a way I had never seen from her. For the first time since the crash, people who had been warm to my sister and cool to me started asking quiet questions. Not confrontational ones, the kind people ask when they're beginning to suspect they've only been given part of a picture. The insurance hearing took place in late January. I sat in that room with my attorney and watched the case I had spent 3 months building get presented in full for the first time. The footage, the receipts, the phone records, the GPS report showing deleted data and what a systems analyst had been able to reconstruct from adjacent records. And then, my sister's fiancé's testimony. He was straightforward. He answered every question without hesitation. He explained what had happened the night of the crash, why he had left the scene, what my sister had asked him to do, and what he had heard in the conversations that followed. When he described overhearing my name mentioned as a solution to the insurance problem, the room went quiet in a way I had never experienced before. I watched the expressions around me shift. Relatives who had sent me those carefully distant messages were suddenly very focused on the table in front of them. A family friend who had been in my sister's corner since the beginning looked like she was trying to fit pieces together that kept refusing to align. My mother looked at the floor for most of the second half of the hearing. My father sat with his hands folded and did not speak. Every document, every timestamp, every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. I had never willingly loaned my truck. I had never been consulted before the story was decided. I had not been anywhere near that highway. The only role that had been assigned to me was the one my family had quietly prepared, the person who would carry the weight of what my sister had done. The consequences arrived in the weeks that followed. Insurance investigators opened a broader review based on what had been presented. Questions were raised about the deleted GPS data and who had the knowledge and motive to clear it. My sister's name was attached to those questions in ways she could no longer deflect. The protection she had relied on her entire life was not available to her in a formal proceeding, the way it had always been available at the dinner table. My parents faced their own reckoning. The family relationships my mother had leaned on for decades grew strained in ways she hadn't anticipated. Relatives who had accepted her framing of events understood over time that they had been given a dishonest picture. Reputations take a long time to rebuild, and that work fell entirely on my parents themselves. I stopped answering their calls in February. Not out of anger alone, though I won't pretend anger wasn't part of it. I stopped because continuing to engage required me to perform a version of normalcy that pretended what had happened was something we could move past with enough time, and enough family dinners, and enough of the usual rituals that cover over what people don't want to name. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. I spent the months that followed rebuilding the way I always had, steadily, without waiting for permission or acknowledgement from anyone. I returned fully to my work, which I loved and had let slide during the worst of the investigation. I spent time with friends who had shown me during that period that loyalty and honesty could exist in the same person. I found a therapist who helped me understand why I had spent so many years softening my own needs inside a family that had never intended to do the same for me. And in the spring, I bought a new truck. I sat in the parking lot for a minute before driving off, thinking about everything that had happened in the 7 months since that Sunday dinner. They had taken something I had built with my own hands and given it to someone else because my boundaries didn't register to them the way my sister's needs did. They had tried to turn my name into the answer to a problem my sister had created. But the plan they built around sacrificing me was the very thing that unraveled every version of the story they had tried to tell. And the person they decided they could afford to lose turned out to be the only one who walked away with everything that actually mattered still intact.